Just a little intro for those who aren't familiar with this. I actually have a little one that I've built here as well myself. We can get into some questions at the end. But basically, I'm incredibly excited about the OpenFlexure project, which I think can be described as microscopy for everyone. Today, we're going to hear from the makers of an open source 3D printable microscope that is capable of creating lab grade images to help screen for disease, assess environmental risks, and analyze materials for a fraction of the usual cost. So OpenFlexure microscope is a game changer for countries who previously had limited access to such technologies. Thought it'd be nice to give a little bit of an intro to our two lovely guests. So Julian is a physicist with significant engineering experience, spanning the design and collaboration of novel scientific instruments through to complex theoretical modeling of Newtonian gravity. His work spans rebuilding and improving the United States NIST milligram level 4 standards to designing a microscope poised to become the first in vitro diagnostic device to be manufactured in Tanzania. So Kostyantyn, joining us from Ukraine today, experienced team leader and project manager at the intersection of physical and digital with a background in startup, cultural, and higher education sectors. He's built and launched multiple digital fabrication labs in the UK and Ukraine. Also a Fab Academy 2015 graduate and a relentless learner and problem solver. So I think we've got such a lovely breadth of experience all around this diverse use of technology. So without further ado, Julian, I'd like to hand over to you to give us an introduction on the project. So we're on mute at the minute, Julian.
Can you hear me? I'm just finding my screen, which is why I'm looking
Lovely.
confused. Uh, Hopefully you can see that.
We can indeed.
Brilliant. So, hi everyone, I'm Julian, as Jude said, and so I'm one of the core developers of the OpenFlexure microscope project. And we always introduce OpenFlexure as microscopy for everyone. And I'm speaking to you as the chief executive of the Humanitarian Technology Trust, which is a new UK charity that we've set up to support projects like OpenFlexure. So, microscopy for everyone. You might think, why microscopes? Does everyone need a microscope? And of course, not everyone themselves needs the microscope, but everybody needs access to microscopy. So microscopy is the gold standard diagnostic test for most forms of cancer, for malaria, for gout, for all sorts of different conditions. And survival rates for conditions like malaria and cancer are dramatically improved by early diagnostics and appropriate treatment. So for instance, malaria has almost 100% success rate if treated early and treated successfully. But still, 500,000 people die each year from malaria, and that's predominantly children under the age of 5 in sub-Saharan Africa. On my slide, you can see Dr. Elise, who is a histopathologist in Rwanda, looking at cancer biopsies, where he's got a manual microscope, and we'll come back to Dr. Elise in a second. So we're actually at a time of widening inequalities. So you can't turn on the news these days without hearing about AI and what it's doing. And so if you go to a pathology conference now, everyone is talking about how do we automate diagnosis. But before you can automate diagnosis, you have to have captured digital images. And so on this slide, we have a picture of a digital scanning microscope that might set you back 50, 80,000 pounds. And if you don't have access to this microscope, you're then also locked out of all of these new technologies that are coming along for automated diagnostics. And it's not like we can just get this microscope and just plonk it down wherever in the world. Whoever designed it expected that you had certain controlled environments, a stable power grid, proprietary consumables would be available. And so how do we actually increase access to something like microscopy? And most people's minds go straight to, well, why don't we just donate equipment? But this is actually not really a sustainable solution to the problem. So what you can see at the back of this slide is a graveyard of medical donated equipment in Malawi. And so press the wrong key. One statistic that's always stuck with me is only between 10 and 30% of donated medical equipment in sub-Saharan Africa ever sees any use at all. Even if you get something into use, what do you do at the point where you need repair? Most companies are not going to send you a spare part for a medical device. They want one of their company engineers to fly out, and then suddenly you're on the line for a business class flight as soon as anything breaks, especially if you're in a situation where there's no one on the same continent as you who can actually do the repair. And so what is often never considered is, are there proprietary consumables needed? Is the necessary infrastructure there? Is training provided? Will this run on a battery power bank, etc.? And so what we're doing at the OpenFlexure microscope is we're designing something entirely different. So it's something that can be locally manufactured and locally repaired. And we're really excited that we were recently featured on the front cover of a World Health Organization report for innovative technologies for low resource settings. But it's more than just a microscope. It's a digital microscope that can build up one of these sort of composite images that could be fed into AI, but also we're not trying to just do AI. It can be used by a doctor and it can be shared across the internet. But this is less than 5% of the cost of one of these commercial devices. And so, I mean, what would it look like in practice? And I say in practice, here, this is actually, if I tap there, that's actually a live microscope sitting behind me up here. And so if you are in a clinic, what you don't want to have to do is make sure that every single time you take a biopsy, you have a doctor on hand to look at it straight away. So if you have a laboratory technician taking a sample, so what we're looking at here is a biopsy that might be used for cancer diagnosis. And so what we need to see is some of these smaller structures that are starting to come into view here, but also a doctor is going to need to look at the wider perspective of where this fits inside a biopsy. And so having a digital microscope, what you can do, your technician can take a sample, they can put it into the microscope, and you can see it's automatically moving around the sample. Now, if you are a pathologist and you come back to it, what you don't want to end up with is a big folder of images and you have no idea which image is where on a sample. So what the software will do, and hopefully it will time fairly well to me talking now, is once it's taken a few images, it will then start to stitch them together into a wider picture, and you can see that it's still scanning around, and what it will do is it will build up a much wider image. So I'm going to pause this for now, but if I move on, what happens then? So the great thing about digital microscopy is you can then get a remote second opinion from anyone on any device. So if anyone has their phone ready, I say on any device, if you scan the QR code in the corner, you should be able to get this same thing up as I have here. But I'm zoomed in right on these few cells. So these are epithelial cells. This is a pap smear for cervical cancer screening. And so down a microscope, you will see approximately this. This is one epithelial cell with the nucleus, and that's what you will need for diagnosing, for looking for cancer in a particular cell. But to look for cancer, you need to look at lots and lots of cells. And so if I scroll and zoom out, you can actually see that we've got all of these images stitched together into one really large composite image. And then a doctor can look at the whole overview, pick a region of interest, and zoom right in to look at individual cells where they think there may or may not be a problem. So the technology works. I hope we've shown that. But the really difficult part of this is how do you actually increase the access to it? And so our model is, rather than setting up one central organization that holds the IP, decides who can manufacture it, what we're doing is we're making the technology open and available for everyone, empowering local enterprises to build locally appropriate solutions with the correct repair and support culture inside their own country. So it's the software is entirely open source, the hardware is open source, and all of the knowledge around the project is entirely open. And I think people often think, hardware, how can hardware be open source? I think open source is now famous enough in the software world that most people understand open source software I can download and freely use. But how do I download a microscope? And so I just want to talk a little bit about a project which also came. So most of the work we did developing the OpenFlexure microscope was at the University of Bath. A project sort of 10, 15 years before at the University of Bath was something called the RepRap project. So here is Adrian, who's actually now chair of trustees for my new charity. Um, he was just the idea of 3D printing, additive manufacturing had just come about. And he was thinking, well, if a 3D printer can 3D print most complex shapes, what stops a 3D printer printing itself? And so he created a 3D printer design where all custom parts for the 3D printer were 3D printed, allowing it to be the first ever replicating machine, a machine that can replicate itself. So that's step one, a machine that could replicate itself. But really, open source is less about how you get the hardware, but the licensing around it, which sounds like somewhat a boring point. But in Adrian's words, if he patented this, if he had put licenses around, so to create one of his RepRap machines, you had to ask for legal permission, then all that is doing is stopping the machine doing the one job it was designed to do, which is replicate itself. So he had to make a self-replicating machine, have a license that allowed anyone free access to replicate uh, to replicate and reproduce the hardware. And so that is the core point of open source. And so often people think, well, what even is 3D printing? You know, it sounds sort of magical if you've never actually had a 3D printer in front of you. And then you realize that a 3D printer is effectively a hot glue gun, that instead of glue coming out, it's plastic. And instead of you sitting there and trying to draw something with a hot glue gun, wait for it to dry and draw a second layer, it's got a robot that layer by layer squeezes out some material, but it's actually not that much more sophisticated than a hot glue gun and a little robot to move it around. So what we can see here is a 3D printer actually printing one of our microscopes. I think this one is in France. And it still amazes me that we can print these bridges, but it seems to work. So in practice, what does this actually look like? In practice, most of open source hardware is actually a website with a lot of instructions. So as long as you've got a lot of instructions, something saying, here's my bill of materials, and here are the plastic parts you need to print. And if I click on the main body, I hopefully get that part that we need to put on a 3D printer. And so as soon as you can take digital files, put them into a device like a 3D printer that turns them into actual things, then you've got open source hardware. You follow the instructions. And Jude, I think, showed at the start of the call that he did manage to build one of these microscopes. I think this is the really core part. We say a microscope that can be made anywhere in the world. And it's not just a microscope that could be made anywhere in the world, but it really has been. Because the proof there is somewhat in the pudding. So we don't have telemetry that tells us where people are building a microscope, what they're doing with it. It's entirely open. We don't track people. So we rely on people happening to come back to us, come to our forum and say, hey, I've built one in Finland. I've built one on the Antarctic sea ice. And we then colour it pink in the map. So we have had somebody use a microscope on the Antarctic sea ice to look at plankton. But the great thing about this sort of network is you start hearing the stories of what people are doing. So we know that in Shashu Bay in Rwanda and Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania, there are trials ongoing for malaria and cancer diagnosis. Also trials in the Amazon in Brazil. We also have a load of workshops happening in Ghana where they're helping university students build, not just use microscopes, but build their own. And one of the most exciting uses of the OpenFlexure microscope is in Ukraine, which Konstantin's going to tell you about in a second. So that's pretty much the end of my slides. We are a new charity, and we are really focused on making microscopy available for everyone. So with that, I'll stop sharing and pass back to Jude and Kostya.
Thank you so much, Julian. That was terrific. And yeah, Kostyantyn, please feel free to share your slides, and we'd love to hear a little bit how it is being deployed in Ukraine at the minute.
being
See,
deployed.
just while Kostyantyn's getting things ready, do check out openflexure.org, I believe it is. So,
Uh, so yeah, thank you everyone for coming, for letting us, for your interest in this subject. I'll quickly give you a bit of context before I dive into OpenFlexure. So this is the image of the first lab that I built in Ukraine in 2014, 2013, that since has been occupied and turned into a prison and a torture chamber. Uh, where's the, yeah, then this is the microscope that I saw at my second attempt at building labs in Ukraine. That was already in years 2018. We were running series of workshops along the contact line, seeing kind of how digital fabrication could help people in those kind of circumstances. And I came across the first, probably a lot of you know it, the folderscope, because there was an agrarian college that had only that one lonely optical microscope standing under a glass box that nobody was allowed to touch. So to help them kind of with the educational process, we ran a workshop building these cheap foldscopes, but they didn't really quite pick up that well because they require quite a bit of microscopy skill and quite a bit of dedication and time from the users to get them going. But then a bit later, for that same college, I built the first OpenFlexure microscope. In 2018, it was, and here you see it working with the people who gonna take it back to Severodonetsk. And later in 22, this very room that you see here has been completely destroyed because Russian army was getting into Severodonetsk through this very hotel and through this very room. So that was kind of my second attempt at digital fabrication process in Ukraine. And this is most recent, this already year 23. We assembled a team of makers, put them in mobile vans with 3D printers, laser cutters, basically fab labs packaged into vans. There's a project called Toloka. We ran it for a couple of years. And in a way, kind of the current OpenFlexure Ukraine project kind of comes out of that. So these are the interventions. That's the map of interventions we managed to run during that time in Ukraine with Tolokas. And here's the first OpenFlexure microscope we built with Toloka that was deployed at the local health monitoring facility. And as you see, kind of we made an effort to make sure that it's delivered not just as a microscope, but as a complete package. Little things like screen, keyboard, mouse, power bank, everything there to kind of to make the user experience as smooth as possible, because the ladies who used to work at the station, they're not the most kind of technically digitally savvy people, but nevertheless, after some time using it, they were completely amazed at how easy it is to take a digital photo of their sample and send it over WhatsApp to their colleagues in the other part of the country, or put it into their presentation for training slides. And never before had they that opportunity to do that, which is kind of, you can only imagine what kind of effect that this can have on the knowledge sharing within these networks. This is already my setup, building, preparing for the workshops on building a bunch of these in Mykolaiv. There's 4 of these almost finished at our workshop in Mykolaiv that we ran. And here, with the support of UNICEF and local administration, there was an event gathering all a group of heads of water treatment facilities from all over Ukraine. So all the kind of middle-aged gentlemen you see here, they're heads of Ukraine water treatment facilities, and young ladies that you see here, they are the what they called recipients of a local award. And then you can see how these people, and actually there on the screen in the center, You can see that lady from Sumy, which was featured on the previous slide. She's explaining to them how they're using this microscope in their practice. As you see, kind of the workshop, just a little tip, my personal discovery obsession with kind of public workshops. When making a big build of these microscopes, rather than giving everybody a sorted, perfectly prepared kit, I dumped all of the parts into container in the middle, and everybody had to go fishing for them, looking for these little bits. It was a terrific social kind of icebreaker. So highly recommend it if you run builds like this. So we had to, yeah, you can see this gentleman digging in with their knives into plastic, and this was not something they expected to encounter at an event like this, but kind of as a general therapeutic making effect, it had its own, it had huge value. Yeah, that's kind of a quick thing. And now, together with Julian and with the support of GIZ, the same German donor who funded Toloka project, we were awarded a small grant that we plan to run several more of these kind of massive build events. Massive. I mean, we plan to build somewhere between 30 and 50 microscopes here, but position them in very key places like healthcare facilities, universities, incubators, things like this. Yeah, one more thing why OpenFlexure is that so when working on Toloka and when driving around Ukraine with these kind of expensive vans with 3D printers, every time you come to a broken down place where people have their houses demolished and like, well, why did you bring the 3D printers? We need shovels. We need hammer drills. So it was a big puzzle for me where to find use and application for this, and that's where we found that actually projects like OpenFlexure, they indeed it's one of the rare examples where this technology meets such real needs in the communities like this, and it's so easy in a way to scale it and deploy it. But what's required is trust building. So medical workers need to trust it, to rely on them. People who can make them, they need to trust that they can make money with them. So in a way, kind of rebooting, giving kind of a nudge to this whole ecosystem is what we're aiming to do now in the next half a year. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Kostyantyn. That's really appreciated. I guess maybe one of the things that when we were having discussions some months back that really stood out for me was I guess what people would probably refer to as localization, in that often what is good for, say, Tanzania might be very different to even what's applicable in Kenya. And of course, then, as Julian had mentioned, one group might be using it for pap smear test, another might be looking at water. One of the things that maybe I wonder if you could speak to a little bit is how you've sort of been sensitive to the fact that this is an open source hardware, but pushing something out to the world isn't the end of the story. It's how do you make that truly local?
Yeah, I mean it's a huge challenge, and I think the first part of that is getting outside your own space. So I think a lot of it's very easy in a university setting. So most of the work was done under a UK academic grant. It's so easy to think, well, if I make this low cost, then I know how much people have on average as an amount of money in country X, therefore it's more accessible. And then you realize that, you know, Amazon isn't everywhere. There's problems with importing certain parts, but you end up with the relative costs of things are so different on import laws. Are they defined as a car part and therefore have so much more tax? And so actually having partners who are there during the early design phase, who are also building it in country and giving you feedback on, please don't use this, we just can't get it, really, really gets you for your sort of base design something that is far more accessible in more places just by having that sort of network that gives you that advice. And then the other thing is, yeah, how do you actually, one, allow localization, but two, have the information to know what things are a good idea to change and what things are a bad idea to change unless you consider these particular things. So we've sort of built up our documentation in a way where we've got multiple variations of the design, but also at certain places sort of information points for why we've done it. But yeah, it's sort of an ongoing learning experience because we definitely went through the point of having too many variations where you can change this, you can change this, and if you work out the combinations, I think we had something like 8,000 different types of microscope, of which five had been tested, and a lot of the other ones didn't work, and that was too far. So yeah, finding that balance is tricky, but it's a learning process.
And I wonder whether you could speak a little bit to, the one of the things I sort of took for granted, should we say, when I was putting mine together, is that, and I'm sure Kostyantyn maybe will want to pick up on this. I took for granted I had stable power supply. That's not a given. And so you could be scanning some samples and then not even a full-blown power cut, but just a spike or a surge. Raspberry Pis are known for not particularly enjoying that. So I just wondered, how did you adapt to, should we say, more gritty and indeed, war-torn environments?
Power bank.
Yeah. How
Um,
did that sort of come to be? Was that something that just self-organized, or was that something that came as a
Totally,
recommendation?
totally. I mean, while I'm in Ukraine, especially, I mean, now power cuts are not so drastic, but in the winter of 22 and 23, these guys kind of pe saved me so much work, and people here just yeah, they you don't imagine your life without a power bank. It's totally natural. There wasn't even kind of a thought, a consideration. If it can run off a power bank, you run it off a power bank.
And I guess one of the things I think you alluded to with the build sessions of chucking everything on the table, in some ways, I would say I'm not really the target audience. I'm a mechanical engineer, so it isn't really fair to say I put this together very easily. But how have you sort of found that onboarding process? Because perhaps it's worth saying for the audience here, RepRap was a self-replicating 3D printer. The target audience was arguably 3D printing enthusiasts, whereas the target audience for you is maybe people who really aren't that interested in 3D printing and might not have that much affinity with mechanical devices. Their training's in medicine. I'm just wondering, how did you sort of broach that end user sensitivity?
Yeah, the assembly is not a problem at all if all parts are printed well and with all the instructions correctly executed regarding the brims and supports and all of that. The assembly, and I tried guiding the assembly first with the presentation on the screen, but then eventually everybody just opened their own OpenFlexure page on their smartphone and proceeded as they at their own pace. So that was the reason. In a way, projects like this, they can become the gateway drugs for many people. That's how the doctors start paying attention that, oh, now I know why 3D printing is important in my case. That's where the kids would be like, oh, that's why electronics is important in my situation. That's the thing. These are such foundational basic technologies these days that pretty much any profession, no matter where, but if you have domain expertise in any narrow field, it can only be augmented by knowledge of this basic 3D printing and electronics, smart devices, let's call them technologies.
But I would say, Kostya, the amount of time that it's got to get us to the project to the stage where you can just open it on a smartphone and the instructions are good enough. Because there's definitely a case of if you're continuously designing something and writing the documentation, it would always go out of date. And so then you'd have, oh, this is from this version, this is from this version. But if you know what you're doing mechanically, you could work it out. But
Mhm.
if it was your first time building something, except maybe a Lego as a child, then the best way to do it is we spent a lot of time going, well, how does Lego do such good documentation? And I mean, it's a microscope. We need more words than Lego, but we tried to, minimize words, short sentences, bullet points, and going through and rendering every single instruction in CAD. So every time we make a change to the design, it updates was a huge change. And mostly because, okay, you can take photos of everything. That's fine. You change one thing that's early in the build process, you cannot be bothered to go through and take 400 new photographs, not just of one microscope, but 4 different variations of the microscope. And so you go, well, that doesn't really affect how everything else works. And then you get an email saying, I think it's wrong. I started it and the instructions were yellow and now it's blue. Should mine have changed blue? Like, it's like, it's sort of like, And so just trying to make something that is turnkey has been we spent more time on documentation than we have on design by far. Like I'd say by probably a factor of 3 or 4. And that's why, having a medical doctor say, I was terrified to build a microscope. I've never used a screwdriver really before, but it works. Then you're like, okay. But we only got that far from, from lots of people reaching out and telling us where it was confusing because we're obviously too close to it so much of the time. So it's that sort of feedback and having a network that feels that it can communicate with you really sort of helps you sort of bridge that gap.
And having a bunch of teams, people doing it at the same time in the same space also helps a lot. And in a way, this kind of documentation mismatch with the reality, I could almost, at least I try to communicate it and motivate to the participants as a feature and not as a bug, because there should always not should always be, but when there is that element of kind of ambiguity and you need to double check and kind of consult and kind of it's that makes for a much stronger learning process. If it becomes that's the thing that even the most complex Lego kit with some patience, my 5-year-old could assemble. Kind of if he just kind of sits down and follows these things, it's perfect. But the learning element from that is very limited. Whereas when people have to kind of okay, this looks here like that, and I have this here like this. How do I make it work? That's kind of challenging, but an important moment in learning. But depending on what objectives you have, of course.
I'm wondering, could I perhaps also package a sort of question with also something I'd ask you to sort of elaborate on? So, a question from Mutala, basically talking about bright field and dark field microscopy. Wondering if you could just extremely briefly explain what that is, but maybe to tee up and fold in another question of you've obviously started off with a microscope. Have you had requests for other lab equipment now that you've got into this space?
Yeah, so I mean, the first Open Flexure paper had dark field and light field microscopy. I don't think I've ever done dark field with it, but I mean, effectively, light field is you shine light straight through the sample. Dark field is you block most of the light, so it comes in at oblique angles, and you get mostly a dark background, and it's only where light scatters that you start seeing things, and it allows you to see certain other types of features. Um, there's all sorts of different microscopy modes we've looked at. We've done a little bit of fluorescence. We've done cross-polarization microscopy where you've got 2 polarizers, so you see nothing and you only see where the sample is by refringent. And I think this comes back to the point we were saying of how do you make something turnkey, all of the documentation. We're in the academic sense that it does that because we've done it once, but we're not in the place where it's actually well documented enough. You didn't have to take a hacksaw at some point or something. It's not well documented enough that somebody can just build it. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to see that KNU, KNUST in Ghana, they're going to work on this. I'm really excited to see where it goes and try and once we get version 7 out, that's very soon, we need to focus on making a lot of the other modes very turnkey.
That's terrific. Thanks so much for that. So I've got a question from Mark on the business model. Essentially just asking, is it reliant on charitable funding, as sometimes this can be a challenge for open source hardware products?
I'd say yes and no. I think the way I look at it is so often if you're starting up a hardware company, you have your initial prototype, which may or may not happen in academia. then they've got this period you call the Valley of Death, where you actually need to do the sort of product design to get it really turnkey enough for manufacturing so you've got money coming in. And the way you get through that Valley of Death is you get somebody to invest a lot of money in the hope that they get the money out. And so what I think needs charitable funding is the Valley of Death. So it is an open source project in the way that anyone can build it and they're allowed to sell it. It's not that they have to give them away for free. This isn't a bake sale. But I think there is a business model in country for the unique selling point is not we're the only people that can build this microscope, but we're the people here that will maintain it. But while I think that there is a really good business model for local manufacturers, that assumes that the project really has all of the design for manufacturing, the technical files, the things that you need to actually get it into a clinic, to get it into education, all of those extra resources that take thousands and thousands of hours to build. Once those are in place. So the Humanitarian Technology Trust sees itself as sort of the bridge over that valley of death for all of these projects that are getting funded all the time in UK academia. We see democratizing this technology happening, and you've got aid money going into academia to design these, and you ask the people who are funding it, going, okay, so what is the plan to actually take the technology out into the real world? And everyone sort of goes, just sort of, no one's actually worked out how we actually bridge that valley of death. And so I think that has to be charitable funding, but I don't think it's charity forever.
And I think that's such an interesting point about the localization, that you've not presumed how someone in Tanzania should optimize for that particular sort of community and culture. Excuse me. One of the things I just thought a nice question here from Nikita, which I think is sort of an important thing to discuss on sort of the hardware movement, is that all these 3D printed parts, how do they sort of hold up in terms of their durability over lifetime? As of course, it's all very well that this is cheaper than a lab grade microscope, but how does it stack up against the actual realistic lifetime of things? Have you got any data or perspective on that?
Yes, we spent a long time thinking, and especially since the microscope is based on flexure joints, so it's actually flexing the plastic. One of the things we did early on in Tanzania was print quite a few microscopes and just have them all day, all night, just moving full forwards and backwards to the edge of their range. And actually, the first thing that we managed to wear out was the M3 lead screw rather than the plastic. Now,
Mhm.
this turned out it wasn't that A2 stainless steel is the weak point, but was a good point around the supply chains that you get are sometimes not necessarily giving you A2 grade stainless steel when you buy parts, both if you buy them say off Amazon or non-reputable suppliers here, or if you're buying things online. So we obviously had some sort of steel cheese alloy for those particular screws. So anyway, we got some better screws from RS Components and ran it again, and we could run for quite a few months if we bought good quality filament. If you bought the cheapest filament that was available, or used old filament that had already got wet, you got brittle parts. And so I reckon it still might only be, I mean, it depends on the humidity, relative humidity. I think in the tropics, you might only get 1, 2 years out of the main body. But if you have a a local supplier who can come in and say, look, all of the difficult to get parts are still fine. We just need the regular maintenance is actually swapping the frame rather than swapping some other particular parts. So I think it's just needs to be factored into regular maintenance, but it's a lot longer than you would just expect if you get good quality filament.
Oh, that's terrific, and I guess that also sort of leads to an interesting thing around the sort of calibration and the technical knowledge that you're having to give instructions, not just how to build it, but also how to use and maintain it. I just wondered, we've got a request. Johnny Wilshire is happy to actually ask his question in person, which is saves me a job. Go
Well,
ahead, John.
it's also easier than typing it out. Thank you. Actually, I had two questions, but you asked the first one already about sort of like what other requests are there for kind of like, because when you take something like that into an environment, you go, oh, if you can make that, can you make me this? But we've covered that. So the second thing was, um, I'm really interested in the kind of like the parallels between this and the My Nature Watch camera project. Just as sort of a build it at home kit where you can sort of put it in your back garden, do whatever else. But I wondered if you've, and this is a kind of like just a random emerging thought that sort of like I can't even say microscopy. Well, I can just about, because it's not said the same as microscope. But there's something about introducing people to the field, not for medical microscopes, but for nature microscopes. And I wonder if you just thought about sort of like how might you do an even simpler version of this that you use for nature. But in a way, you could then say if you buy one of these kits, you help fund the medical one. So it's almost like a crowdfunding angle into that crossing the valley of death.
Yeah, and so I mean, we do have a fantastic collaborator in Argentina who, so the early microscopes we had, the one with the gears, but you could also just turn the gears. And he was saying that I don't need it motorized. What I'm looking at is soil health. So he does soil microscopy. And a lot of his work was trying to get farmers to use practices which didn't think of just bulk nitrogen, bulk phosphorus, but think of what's living in the soil. So what he wanted is a microscope where he can actually get people's soil and show them what's living in it because it's so much better than coming along with a textbook or taking a sample, going away, coming back and going, there's not much life in that. So he did not want to have to source very expensive objectives. He did not want to have a separate computer inside it. So we've got one with the same basic stage, but these sort of big flower-like knobs that you turn to just move around manually. And you take a Logitech webcam that is really, really available, take off the lens, because that lens is so close to the camera, it's basically like a microscope lens but backwards. So you turn it round, 3D print something to separate it from the camera, and you have not a perfect microscope, but you've got a pretty good microscope that plugs just into your laptop, and you can walk around and show people. So I don't think we've really thought about how we sell those for crowdfunding, but it's definitely something we need to think about in terms of if manufacturers are setting up, if we set the barrier at you can't get any money in for your business until you've hit medical certification, that's not a good model for most people's business. So having educational microscopes, having microscopes for ecology are definitely things on the radar. And I think also from an educational perspective, allowing people to build their own scientific equipment is very, very empowering. Just seeing how something goes together and learning that science isn't a black box that arrives from Fisher. It's something that you can do yourself.
Awesome, absolutely. Thank you.
No, that's terrific. And maybe a nice sort of build on that sort of like learning and documentation process. I've got another question from Mutala, basically saying OpenFlexure Connect has less documentation. It would be nice to have at least videos explaining the software and more documentation would be helpful. I guess I even confess I still went to YouTube, and I guess maybe that's the rather lovely thing about a community. Someone had posted a build video on a bit that I was a little unsure of on the documentation. So please feel free to expand on that a little bit, either of you.
I'm going to say something quickly, and I'll pass over to Kostya because he'll have a different perspective having built it and then tried to work out how to use it. But every time you write documentation to make one thing better, you realize the next. So, we managed, it was so hard to get people to be able to build a microscope. Now that's somewhat turnkey. They're going, I built a microscope. How do I use it? And you go, we need to write the user documentation. And then you tell people how to, and it's like, so OpenFlexure Connect is the software interface. And we're actually in the middle of rewriting the whole software interface. And so if anyone in the community does, so we need documentation for version 2, but it will take about the time that by the time we build that, we'll have version 3. So it's part of having the charity is to allow us to think about these community aspects that are really important, like user documentation, because especially when you're on an academic grant, all of our time doing documentation was very hard to swing as research. So it was generally done at evenings and weekends and in between to sort of enable the research. So it's trying to make it more sustainable and build up these sort of resources is very high on our agenda. But yeah, Kostya, I'd be really interested in your perspective on
Yeah, I mean,
coming
in
to the.
general, if you see this kind of as knowledge generating tools that also OpenFlexure in a way is almost like a perfect combination of uh, carrots in front of your nose every time. It looks very close, kind of, oh, I just need a 3D printer to build a microscope. Oh, I just need to 3D print a microscope to do actual microscopy, and kind of uh, it keeps you motivated enough to kind of keep on solving those challenges, even when they arise. And in this way, I think that kind of continuous rawness of it, that sort of slight I mean, of course, at some point it would be great to have kind of a finished packaged shiny product, kind of here's OpenFlexure thing put on the shelf and sold as Lego kits, but that would be a totally different thing by then. I think the fact that this project gets so many people interested in these subjects and challenges them to kind of to discover and pick up new skills and learn how to troubleshoot electronic things and firmware flashes on Raspberry Pi and kind of mechanical fasteners, quality of screws in the assemblies. In my experience, this is a great kind of motivator and educator that people can just um, yeah engage with, and it automatically provides that motivation for people to do that. As long as you have a bit of realistic expectations that you don't overpromise that you click a button and your microscope is here in front of you. As long as people have enough time and space to engage with these things, everybody can build. Also, what Julian was says, he is kind of the simplest version of it, or there can be a much more complex version of it. And when it's an open source project, it can be this whole family. But then navigating that family becomes a challenge for people trying to build it. Which microscope should I build? Which one do I need? Which one can I build? And that kind of triggers all of these conversations. That triggers people kind of starting paying attention to these tools, to these technologies, to other people, kind of what's needed, and being confronted with all of these questions. So I find that an incredibly powerful thing, and not necessarily. Uh, so as an open source project, I hope that will always stay there because it will continue evolving. But yeah, I mean, looking at what RepRap did, what happened to RepRap, and what happened to 3D printers market, now we're in a place where Joseph Prusa comes on stage and says open source is dead, and Prusa starts patenting their own pieces of their hardware. I mean, in general, we don't have enough time to engage with big open source subjects, but particularly 3D printers and everything with open source technologies in Ukrainian war made me kind of reconsider a lot of idealistic things and ideas about the values of kind of free knowledge sharing, or at least kind of its implications, so how it should be done. Not to say that things need to close, but we need to be pay much more close attention. This is not just an idealistic goal anymore to say that this free knowledge should be accessible to everybody everywhere. Some maybe, but which exactly we need to give it a bit more thought.
I wonder whether that's a nice segue into a question actually from Chris of what is the vision and what's next for the Humanitarian Technology Trust?
Yeah, so we called it the Humanitarian Technology Trust, not the OpenFlexure Foundation, specifically so there can be a what's next. I think probably for the first 3, 4 years, we're going to be focused almost entirely on OpenFlexure, on getting everything ready so it's turnkey for manufacturers to start getting a product out. and really sort of pushing through the medical the documentation so manufacturers can get medical certification in country. And I think that is a few years worth of work. Um, but our plan is to be really, really open in documenting how we've done it, what's worked, what hasn't, so that we are available, so we have capacity, or when we have capacity, we can start scaling up on what the next project is. So we've had a few ideas. One thing, if we were staying very much in the microscopy space, that people have talked to us about is, okay, it's fine having a microscope to scan your sample once it's been fixed and stained, but what about an auto stainer? And I think an auto stainer is, it's a relatively simple device, but it's basically something that dips something in one fluid and then dips it in another fluid and then dips it, and you move between different buffers and different stains. But being able to do that in a really reproducible way creates much better slides for imaging, and sounds like a tractable engineering project, but also we don't have an open source one to start on, so we'd be starting from scratch. There's somewhat a philosophical question of, are we the organization that takes really promising things from somewhere like academia and brings them, does that valley of death, or do we sometimes, if it's needed, start again from scratch? And I'm very interested to see what my thoughts will be in a few years, but I think the auto stainer sounds at least like a fun project because everyone likes starting things.
I think that's such an interesting point, and maybe just to sort of bring in the initial fascination and relevance to ecological citizens. One of the things that I love about this project is that it's so much more than just a little 3D printed, gizmo. We've got all this sort of thing of how you don't have to be a technologist, you don't have to be an engineer. As you pointed out, Julian, even someone who's very, very good at documentation and just has a real knack of this, it almost speaks to things like Wikipedia. And indeed, one of the questions from Mark was wondering, what happens if you did partner with iFixit, which for anyone who hasn't heard of them, are kind of a bit of a gold standard of how to disassemble and reassemble things. So I just wondered whether you had any holistic views on partnerships and new collaborations and really going beyond just the thing, but almost into a wider vision.
So partnerships and collaborations is something we definitely need to explore. So iFixit and a lot of their underlying technology is Dozuki had ridiculously good instructions on how to write instructions. So we spent a long time looking through their, they're the ones that told us, stop writing big paragraphs, take photos from the perspective that you're going to do it rather than photos of you doing it. I'd say for our actual documentation, we have so much more custom automation. So we change one thing and it updates in 7 different places. So we only have to write things once. So we're unlikely to be able to change to any other technology. But being able to have those sort of partnerships, so in the way that we learned from iFixit and Dozuki on how to write good documentation, we need to find those same sort of partners that can help us write our technical files when we come towards the medical space, when we start writing user manuals, or really writing a better user manual. We've got sort of the outlines of one. Need to find these sort of organizations where that is their bread and butter. And even if they're not doing the work for us, just, that sort of, what do you tell new employees on day one? Just give us that sort of, that sort of overview breakdown is something that's sort of, it's very easy to overlook as an academic. I think physicists sort of have this sort of, I'm a physicist, I can do anything. And, you probably could, but, not that well. So yeah, we need to, we definitely need to find these sort of organizations like iFixit that are leaders in their space and sort of pick their brains and work out the best ways to do things.
So I think I'm just looking at the time now, and I know there's probably like about a minute left. I can see that there's already some fabulous questions. So all I would urge people is if you could kindly comment on some of the posts on social media or LinkedIn, or if you prefer, get in touch and we'll pass those on to Julian and Kostyantyn via email. But honestly, I think it's testament to the fact that we've still got more questions and just not enough time, that this has been a terrific session. So thank you both so much.